Hey everyone, Hashi here with Red Giant, and welcome to the first ever episode of Cheap Tricks, where each month I'll be showing you how to create some of Hollywood's most amazing effects right at home. Ever since I was a kid, I've loved seeing imaginations come to life through visual effects on the big screen. When I went to see Wrinkle In Time, I couldn't help but think about how many of the effects could be pulled off right at home using some of Red Giant's tools. To test out some of these effects, we decided to put together a little VFX trailer. I knew I needed an awesome young actor to work with on this project, and who better than someone who appears right in the opening scenes of A Wrinkle in Time.
Hi, my name is Leah Wilson, and I play Young Meg in A Wrinkle in Time. It was amazing because they were really nice to me, and it felt like it was just one big family, and it was just really cool.
Awesome.
That's awesome.
But one thing I didn't get to do was all the visual effects. I didn't personally get to test it, but I would love to.
All right, should we go do that today?
Yes.
All right, let's go.
I had a blast filming with Lyric. She's a real pro. Now I'm going to take some time to break down some of these shots and show you exactly how to pull off these looks at home. One of them is the environmental distortion you see happening to the ground plane and some of the other elements in the shot. Next, we have that shimmery glass curtain effect hanging down from the sky, literally representing the wrinkle in time that these characters could pass through in the movie. Lastly, as you can see in the trailer, the characters find themselves in some really wild alien environments. I'm going to show you how you can manipulate some stock photos to end up with this really immersive environmental effect. So let's go. Let me start with a simple overview of displacement, using a text layer. If I apply a displacement map to a text layer, nothing exciting happens at first, because it really wants the input of a displacement layer. I'll create a few examples with some solids. We'll add a checkerboard effect to 1, checking the add mode to preserve the alpha channel. We'll also create a ramp on sample 2. We'll narrow that down a bit. And lastly, let's use one of our universe generators, the fractal background. This one is even animated by default. I'll make these layers lightly visible so you can see what's happening. Back in my text layer, I can now use these as displacement maps. I'll select the one I want. I'll check effects and masks, and also luminance in these two channels. Now watch. You can see the white sections move the text information in one way, and the black squares translate it in the opposite direction, leaving a stark line between the checker areas. If I select the gradient ramp, it's so soft that the final effect looks like slanting the text. The lighter the color, the more it translates. If I push these values or tinker with some of the advanced settings, I can get some really crazy stylized effects, or even title design ideas. One important thing to note is that anything in the displacement map that is at 50% gray will not move at all. That'll come in handy later. Watch as I apply this last animated layer as the displacement map, and well, you get the idea. Now for the trailer of A Wrinkle in Time, the text crinkles a bit, kind of this broken mirror effect. For that, I'll need a different type of displacement map. I'll use a solid and generate a cell pattern effect. I'll select the Plates HQ mode. I'll crank up the scale and sharpness. When I apply it as the displacement map, you can see that kind of fractured look I was going for. And if I want, I can even animate the evolution of this effect to get some cool procedural results. Perhaps even throwing an expression, time times 50, on the evolution to let this evolve on its own. Depending on the scale of the plates in this layer, you can get some really crazy shattered looks. But I'm going to go back to the look from the trailer. I'll throw in some color ramps, and also a couple light swipes to add a little detail to this text. Then I'll throw in an instance of Trapcode Starglow, which automatically generates little glowing highlights wherever the values are the highest. I can dial down the threshold till I just get a few glints in the top corners. And I've got a simple title that I can type anything into. I'll add the obligatory slow scale up keyframes. But this is child's play. What about that weird ground thing you mentioned? Well, actually it works off of these same principles, but in a whole new dimension. Yeah, I'm talking about doing this with 3D layers. So grab a piece of footage, motion track it, and create a ground plane. Now, if I generate a map on this 3D layer and try to use it as a displacement map, you'll see the effect doesn't work. Unfortunately, the masks and effects pull down doesn't do the trick either, and neither does precomposing the 3D layer, even with collapsed transformations. You'll need to copy the camera over to a pre-comp to effectively have a duplicate 3D comp, one for your footage and one for the displacement map. So now After Effects is happy that it has one nice flat layer that it can apply as a displacement map, matching all of the camera animation, etc. Now, if I adjust the displacement map, I actually get what I wanted. The distortion appears locked to the ground. Playing with various bump maps will yield all sorts of interesting results. You can hand animate layers or waves or ripples to move in any direction you want, and the cool part is that to a certain extent, they can really look like ripples in the ground. If you push too far, you might get some weird, sharp distortions. And if you push further, you could get these kind of watery ripples. Now, these weren't desirable for the effect that I was going for, but they could be an interesting way to create a unique puddle or portal. For each shot that featured this effect, I had my motion-tracked footage in one comp, and then a duplicate comp with the same camera alongside it with a unique displacement pattern. Often it was just some fractal noise that I'd animated to flow in one direction. In one case, I even used a blurry radio waves effect. I needed to place the girl's legs in front of this distortion effect, so in this comp I did that by creating a 3D plane that was approximately where she was standing. Since she was standing pretty still and the 3D plane was already set to track with the camera, I only needed a few keyframes. In these other shots, I used the roto brush, and I actually got a pretty fast result. I also planted a few clone-stamped little patches on the ground plane underneath to effectively erase the character. Now, these patches didn't need to be perfect, just enough so I wouldn't get distorted edges of the character peeking out when I used my displacement map. In this very first shot, I also added a burst of dust using Trapcode Particular. I placed a box emitter right on the ground that spit out some cloudlet particles with shadowlet settings enabled. I added a little wind so it would kind of drift up, and turned the opacity way down so it was pretty subtle. Now, if you're new to Particular, I highly suggest checking out Harry Frank's in-depth series on this plugin and all its features right here on this channel. So in summary, playing around with the displacement maps can give you some really cool effects without having to do a whole lot of work. You could even use your displacement map to aid in the shading of something that you create. I mean, there are some really cool things you could do using this technique. Now, let's move on to section 2, that glassy curtain effect. It was actually really simple to create with Trapcode MIR. MIR is a very fast plugin for rendering these 3D sheets that react to the camera. They can be affected by fractal noise and used for motion design or lots of other things. In this case, I was going for the look of some theatrical curtains that would kind of wave in the breeze. Once I'd motion tracked my footage and created a camera, I added MIR to a solid. I adjusted its position, made it taller and wider, and then upped the vertices to add some better resolution. Then I pulled in a comp that had a gradient ramp that was black on top and white at the bottom. Now this layer can remain hidden within the comp. Under the fractal settings in MIR, I can select this as an amplitude layer, and you can see that the map is working as a multiplier for that fractal distortion pattern. The ripples become almost nothing at the top, but the bottom is still nice and wrinkly. By opening up the individual amplitude and frequency, I can dial down the frequency of the Y channel and end up with something that looks more like draped cloth. You'll need to play with these settings as there are really infinite combinations, and your eye is probably searching for one. Now, just like any good fractal-based plugin, MIR has an evolution setting. You can click and add keyframes to this, or you can alt-click and add an expression. I'm going to type in time times 50, which will cycle the evolution 50 degrees every second. At first things were a little bit too fast and wrinkly, so I slowed down the expression and also simplified the fractal. Now I'm really liking the motion of this thing. In the shader setting, I'll switch the blend mode to normal, and the result is great. It's a really quickly generated but beautiful curtain. These little spectral highlights and all, and I'm just scratching the surface of what MIR can do. I could apply a texture to this 3D sheet, play with the lighting settings, but right now I'm really just looking for this quick result. Now when you look at a transparent object, there isn't a lot of apparent shading on it. Usually just those spectral highlights really come through. One of the more visually informative things about glass is its refractive properties, meaning how it scatters or distorts the light passing through it. Now I could use a displacement map to simulate this, but I've got something even prettier. It's a universe plugin called Prism Displacement. I'll apply that to an adjustment layer behind the original MIR layer. Select the MIR layer as the displacement source, and then tell the source to be the alpha channel pre-multiplied with gray. If I solo just the prism displacement effect for a second, you can see that the default result is this really cool wobbly glass-looking surface. In fact, there's a setting called glass refraction within the plugin. The prismatic effect is that there's some built-in chromatic separation between the colors, so up close there's this kind of rainbow effect visible in the highlights, similar to looking through a prism. Playing with these settings allows you to get the glass and refractive property you want in your comp. Turning the MIR layer back on, we now get this delightful combination of a glass-like distortion and some cool highlights in the shape information from the MIR layer. I added a null light factory on top of everything and attached it to a 3D null through a handy expression. You can also tell null to track some 3D lights and get a similar result, I just didn't happen to here. As a last little bit of detail on the curtains, I added some Trapcode Star Glow to add some golden sparkly highlights to everything. Kinda pretty, right? I only saw the film once, but this is kinda what I remember the phenomenon looking like. And if I wanted, I could totally nudge this into like an annihilation shimmer effect, but someone's already totally done that. Moving on, let's get out of here and into an establishing shot on an alien planet. Now here's the final shot. And here's the source footage.
Action.
Obviously a lot has to happen to make this effect work, but in our case, we're just going to send our girl to like another terrestrial planet with a totally agreeable atmosphere. I've always kind of wondered if there are planets in the Star Wars universe that have atmospheres that don't really work for humans. I mean, they barely needed like a little airline oxygen mask to survive a space slug on an asteroid. But what was I talking about? Oh yeah, rotoscoping characters. It's always a pain in the butt, but I knew I was going to have to do this, so I employed a special technique called planning. Yes, I knew I wanted to turn this around quickly, so planning was definitely important. I knew that Lyric's hair would be the hardest thing to roto, so I made sure that it would end up in front of the sky in the plate that I shot. She's also angled to have a lot of shadow on her back, and her clothing color was something different enough from the mostly grass background behind her legs. Knowing roughly what she was going to be composited in front of was important too. I wanted the alien background plate to have similar lighting and also a similar horizon line, so I wouldn't really have to worry as much about the edge artifacts. So how does that all come into play when you're staring down the barrel of a 230 frame roto job? Let's watch the clock. Starting at about 10 AM, I garbage matted out the top half of my actor and applied a Primat keyer to the sky color. By 10:04, I can jump right into rotobrush country. Now I had Lyric jump and land right at the head of this footage, and I knew that this would be the most intense part, requiring the most attention to detail. Now remember, I'm only really focusing on the roto below the horizon line. These first 50 frames took about 12 minutes, but after that, the remaining 180 breezed through mostly on autopilot, and I was freezing my rotobrush about 5 minutes later. I spent about 10 more minutes fussing with her hair when it's below the horizon line, and blending my rotobrush bottom half with my keyed top half. but for a full body 10-second shot in 30 minutes, I call it a success. I decided to preserve part of my ground plane, like a little cliff she was standing on. The ground in this field was relatively flat, so by creating a copy of the 3D tracked ground plane, I could simply draw the shape I wanted and use it as an alpha matte for the original footage. And now you can see it looks like a little pathway just floating. I added some roughened edges to make things a little bit more organic. To make it look like there was some depth to this, I photoshopped a little generic cliff face texture. I brought this into After Effects and turned it into a couple of different 3D cards. Now, using that guide ground plane, I could align these 3D layers and also drew some custom masks, just so these kind of simulated the sides of this little cliff face. Adding in one more copy here and roughly aligning it with the angle of this cliff. And one more clever mask. And I've got my shape. Switching between the custom camera and the scene camera gave me a really easy way to preview the 3D shape. Lastly, I did a bit of color correction on the sides of these, and the final result is pretty great. Next came the background, the actual, quote, other planet. Well, I didn't want to work too hard, so I didn't. After looking around on Pond 5 for an environment that kinda looked decent, I found this one. I downloaded a sample and placed it into my background to see if I liked it. Once I did, I spent a cool $7 on this version that was high enough resolution for my purposes, and then threw it into Photoshop. I isolated the mountains with a quick select tool, then applied the liquefy effect. The landscapes in Wrinkle in Time were weird but familiar, and that's what I wanted to do here. Just distort everything until we got some pushed shapes that you wouldn't really see on Earth, but nothing that looks too smeary. Next I moved on to the sky, where I used the content-aware fill tool and some clone stamping to create an all-cloud layer. I painted the layer that represented the blue sky, and then I keyed out the sky color from that cloud layer. This way I can paste a generic planet right behind the clouds, and voila! Instant interdimensional planet look. And in case you're worried about it, the other planet has really low gravity, is tidally locked to this one, so this planet is totally sustainable. Once I bring my layers into After Effects, I animated the Photoshop comp by turning the cloud layer 3D and adding some subtle movement. I used the location of the faraway nulls from my 3D track to place the comp, and then I used a little trick to bend layers. That is, I adjusted the anchor point to about right here below the horizon, duplicated the layer, and then rotated a bottom copy, and stretched it forward. This way there's a little bit of parallax that you get, and it's not just one flat card. I pre-composed the foreground and background layers so I could easily work with them as two separate elements, adding a little bit of light fog in between the two and some subtle light wrap on top. Next I shopped through Magic Bullet Looks, where I could really quickly preview a bunch of cool different ways this planet could look. I've also added what my good friend Eric calls a load-bearing lens flare, because why not? One very last-minute addition was these bubbly particles that float by. To do this, I added a light called Motion Path 1. Now this wasn't so I could use it as an actual light, it was so I could use it as a finely tunable particle path. I animated the path to curve right past Lyric and then on into the background. I added a new solid with a particular effect, and way down under the air settings, I can select Motion Path 1. This tells Particular to let its generated particles flow along a specific path. But one more thing I need to do is make sure that the emitter is aligned with the first part of this motion path. I could do that by kind of copying and pasting the values over from this motion path, but I have a feeling I might be playing with these values, so I'm going to link them with a really simple expression. I'm going to pick whip the position of the particle generator to the location of the motion path light, and then type dot value at time 0. Now as I move this path around, the generator will always start at the first frame of the motion path. Particular comes with a bunch of really cool sprites. Shopping through them, I chose this bubble one, and then played with a few different settings, and let these bubbles flow right along the motion path, and off into the background. And there you have it, the final look of this interdimensional planet landscape. Full body roto and full background replacement in a really slim timeline. And that's really everything. So to summarize, we learned a little bit about displacement maps and the different ways you could use them to create different looks. How you can use pre-composed 3D displacement maps to move along with camera movements. A really fast way to do a glass cloth simulation. And finally, an immersive environmental effect, using as few resources as possible. Now, copying or mimicking some of these Hollywood effects is a great way to sharpen your skills or learn some new techniques. But the next step is to take some of those new techniques and skills and apply them to new effects that no one's ever seen before. Really make them your own. Now, you don't need a big Hollywood budget to pull off some of these amazing visuals. Just a little bit of dedication, a lot of time, and a few cheap tricks. Thank you guys for joining us for this first episode of Cheap Tricks. If you guys have any suggestions for VFX challenges you'd like to see us tackle, please let us know below, and we'll see you next time.